What's up, everybody? Welcome to week 3 of the walkthrough with me, Jamie Hoyle, and our special guest, Arif Hasan from the Norse Code podcast. Arif, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I know we have a lot of people in our audience that listen to you and love you, so they're excited to have you on this week. So there's a lot of talk in our Discord about having the great Arif Hasan on and what it's going to do for the show. So I'm looking to ride your coattails today.
Whatever you say, I'll believe everything. Sure.
All right. So week 3, we've got Chargers and Vikings. So we're going to talk a little bit about the game, talk about some storylines heading into the game, and talk some matchups and probably make a prediction at the end and kind of see where the conversation takes us. So it's hard to talk Chargers and Vikings after 2 weeks without addressing the elephant in the room. So we'll just get it out of the way. Close games. What in the world is it going to take for one of these two teams to win a one-score game?
So a lot of people have been in my mentions saying that they're pretty confident that this is going to be a tie. But it's like hard to like push back. It's like, yeah, I see where you're coming from. That one makes sense to me. It's tough. The Vikings were really bad in close games in 2021, and then they were just like meteorically good in 2022. Just like astounding. I can't believe it. What's going on here? Type good in 2022. And then, of course, 0-2 the very next season, which is how all of this really works out, right? Like you can't be consistently good at close games. The way you get good at football is not by winning close games. It's by making games not close, right? And so that's like really the key, whichever team, avoids, because I know both of these teams are relatively efficient when you take away turnovers, right? So it's that I think is going to, and it's so boring for an analyst to say, oh, whichever team wins the turnover battle. But it really feels like this is kind of the area where both teams have like an enormous opportunity to improve. So, yeah. I mean, I think that's the real, like someone's going to win a close game, I bet. Historically, that's probably the Vikings. I mean, the Chargers have been just dramatically unlucky in close games, but like, yeah, who knows, right?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how one-score games are always up and down for everybody, but that's not really the case for the Chargers. It's never been the case for the Chargers. One-score games are a nightmare. If they're not winning by 2 scores, they're probably not going to win. So, and they don't win by 2 scores a whole lot anymore anyway. So, yeah, I think, turnovers are obviously going to play a big factor, which, like you said, is kind of cliche. Anybody can say that. I think for the Chargers, they really have to win the third quarter. This is a team that tends to close the first half out pretty well. They almost always go into a lull in the third quarter, and they've got a race to play catch up and try to win the game in the fourth quarter. So I think a big focus for the Chargers this week and this season has to be improving on their abysmal third quarter offensive production from what they had last year and what they've had the first 2 weeks this year.
Well, so to that end, like changing an offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, right? Everyone was talking about how good the offensive coordinator was like 2-3 years ago. And then people got a little bit disenchanted with what he was able to do with the Cowboys. I mean, what has been kind of, the temperature on Moore? Are people really happy, or are people just more focused on like, let's get Brandon Staley out of here? They're not really having this conversation about Kellen Moore.
I think most people are pretty happy with Moore. I think if you're really watching the games closely, what you see is they're putting themselves into positions to win in different ways. So week 1, the passing game wasn't really clicking, which is super frustrating for a team that's quarterbacked by Justin Herbert and has, Mike Williams and Keenan Allen and all those guys to throw to. You would expect them to be more efficient throwing the ball. And they had a very kind of college, gimmicky, horizontal passing attack week 1, which seemed like it was really just designed to complement what was a really good running game. It was the best running game in the league week 1. And then last week, they built a lead primarily through the passing game. They were not running the ball that well against Tennessee. And they were able to throw the ball down the field. They were finding plays in the seams, in the middle of the field behind the linebackers and in front of the safety. And they were starting to challenge areas of the field that Justin Herbert hasn't traditionally challenged with 2 deep safeties. And so I think the ability to shift the game plan week to week based on the opponent is huge, because that didn't happen at all the last couple of years with Joe Lombardi. It was the same game plan every week. And they've shown the ability to be efficient running the ball and be efficient passing the ball. They just haven't done it both in the same game. So I think if they can put those two things together, and like Staley's been talking about, marry them and have the running game kind of fuel the passing game and create more opportunities downfield, I think they'll have more success. But they're working some things out, new offense, new terminology. And the starters didn't play in the preseason, so they didn't get these reps outside of camp. So it's different, practice versus game. The speed is different, the intensity is different. So they're still figuring out what works and what doesn't. But I think overall, Moore's done a pretty good game, and yeah, everybody's focused on firing Brandon Staley.
Yeah, right.
How about with the Vikings? What's the offense been like, and how are things working? I know obviously the big storyline is Justin Jefferson first 2 weeks, but what's been?
Yeah, he's doing all right. Yeah,
working? He's been all right.
Yeah. So again, if you, and I know you can't just like get rid of turnovers, but I think it provides appropriate context to say this. If you get rid of turnovers from every offense in the league, and the ability to avoid turnovers is a skill. So this is not, me saying that this is the case, but if you remove turnovers from every offense in the league, number one, Miami Dolphins, based off of, sorry, but based off of what we've seen, that makes a lot of sense. Number two is the Minnesota Vikings, right? They're like, just in terms of EPA per play, right? They're remarkably good at moving the ball down the field, getting into scoring range. And then, Justin Jefferson fumbles, at the 0.1 yard line, fumble goes out the back of the end zone. It's a touchback, whatever you want to think about the rule, that's what happened. Kirk Cousins throws like 3 inches behind KJ Osborne. It's in the crook of his arm. It gets plucked out of his arm for an interception. Ed Ingram, knocks the ball off the snap out of Kirk Cousins' hands. These are all turnovers that, first of all, the Vikings haven't recovered a single fumble. But these are all turnovers that have occurred in scoring distance. In fact, often in the end zone, basically, before the Vikings have the opportunity to turn something like an expected point position into like real points that count towards winning actual football games. And that's depressed their real scoring. And then there are other cases where, like, defensively, the Vikings are a slightly above average defense when you eliminate turnovers entirely. But that's maybe a suggestion that the Vikings should cause more turnovers. But like defensively, it's kind of a somewhat similar story. There's a drive from the week 1 against the Buccaneers where they give up 3 points without giving up a single yard, right? Which I know that happens to every team, but at the moment, that those kinds of drives where it's like a limited yardage but points, those kinds of drives constitute a decent chunk of the amount of points that they've given up. Now, the defense still has a lot to work on. It's pretty personnel deficient. They have a new defensive coordinator that they're really happy with, but the offense is causing problems for both the offense in terms of scoring and the defense in terms of preventing scores. And so when you can kind of isolate which the problems are real problems or which of the problems come from what, you can get a sense of how good this offense could really be. Because Cousins is playing really outstandingly good football. I've seen Cousins play some of the best football you've ever seen. And then, for the next 3 weeks, it's like bottom tier stuff. So I'm not saying we're going to see that for the rest of the season because he's streaky. I mean, that's just what happens, right? So sometimes he puts together these amazing, basically months of play. Like there's like just 4 weeks where he plays. Like I think he's won NFC Offensive Player of the Month like nearly every year of his career with the Vikings. And what has that turned into, right? So right now he seems to be kind of in the middle of this outstanding stretch of play. It hasn't turned into a bunch of points yet, but for the most part, people are pretty happy with the production of the offense. I still have some concerns. I think that offensive line is a big concern. I think that they're not doing enough to protect Cousins in that context. And based on what I said, you might think I think that Cousins is this amazing quarterback. He's not. He's a very good quarterback, but he needs the right circumstances to succeed. I mean, one of the things that differentiates him from Justin Herbert is that Herbert is very good under pressure. I mean, that's the thing that he got known for his rookie year was his performance under pressure, his ability to adapt and improvise. And that's not something that Cousins has been able to do a lot. He did it a lot last year. I don't know if that's historically just not a skill that he has. Under pressure, he's been, there's been some kind of back and forth in terms of how good he can be, but certainly he is a quarterback that benefits more than most quarterbacks from a stable, clean pocket. And the Vikings have not been able to provide that for him on a consistent basis, especially with that interior offensive line as weak as it is, which is why they hired Dalton Risner or signed Dalton Risner just a bit ago. We don't know where he's going to start or if he's going to start or what the plan is there. But that's it. Obviously, Justin Jefferson, I think, really good argument. He's the best receiver in the league. I think most people just kind of agree on that now. A couple weeks down the road, I'm sure we'll have an argument with like Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill and so on. But for now, people think Justin Jefferson fairly is the best receiver in the league. And Jordan Addison is playing really well. He's got 2 games of 60 plus yards, which is, first 2 games. Everyone's talking about Puka Nacua, and they should right now, best rookie. But it's pretty rare for a rookie receiver to have the production that Jordan Addison is having. It's just Zay Flowers is producing more, Puka Nacua is producing more in the first 2 games of their career. But he's playing very well. I happen to think that it's a little bit fluky, so we're not going to see him consistently produce at that level, but he's a very good big play threat. Then you've got TJ Hawkinson, and the Vikings have figured out last year very quickly how to make Hawkinson and Jefferson complement each other in these really devastating ways that allow them to take advantage of how much gravity Jefferson has, or on some plays, Hawkinson's going to have more gravity just because of the coverage that's called or what people expect. Take advantage of the gravity that Hawkinson has. So a really excellently designed offense. I thought from a play design perspective, their performance against the Eagles is some of the best I've seen from like an offensive coordinator type, evaluation. Some pretty bad drops. Obviously, Cousins is partially responsible for at least 2 of those fumbles that he's been subject to. I think the third one where an offensive lineman knocks out of his hand, I'm not going to hold it against him, but he's partially responsible for those fumbles, and he used to have a big fumble problem, so maybe that's rearing its head again. But there's some other issues as well. But I'm pretty optimistic about this offense. I think it's maybe due is the wrong term, but I think it's set up to score a lot of points. Probably not going to finish second in the NFL by the time it's all done, but right now that's kind of where they're positioned.
So you mentioned pressure, people getting to Cousins and causing pressure. Is that a function of the interior guys not playing well in Cleveland and Ingram? Is that a function of Garrett Bradbury not being healthy and not being on the field? Or is that kind of a combination of both?
Well, it's all of those play a role, as does the fact that Cousins holds onto the ball a little bit longer than a quarterback in his position typically does. He makes up for it with these big plays, so that doesn't bother me, but you can't really blame all of the pressure entirely on this offensive line. That said, the interior offensive line is one of the weaker ones in the league. And I know I'm talking to Chargers fans when I say that, right? Like I know, like that it's kind of but I mean, since like 2015, the Chargers and the Vikings have had some of the worst offensive lines in the NFL. And a lot of that is built off of this history of injury that both teams have had along the offensive line. But a lot of it is just sometimes the guys that they get are just not as good as we expect them to be. And right now, Ed Ingram, I think, is one of the least reliable guards in the NFL. And he's causing a lot of problems, not just, he's causing a random fumble here or there, but also he's giving up pressure really quickly. He seems he doesn't have very much feel in a lot of ways. And by that, I mean, like when he's on a double team run blocking, he doesn't know when to get off the double team. He just doesn't have that kind of feel. When he has a man assignment in pass protection, he doesn't know that he should probably abandon that when his center has him and there's a blitzer coming, right? Like that's not technically in your assignment, but a lot of offensive linemen can intuit that they should break their assignment to do that sort of thing. Christian Darrisaw does that, right? And you got to be good enough to know when to break the rules. And right now, Ingram is not good enough to do that. And sometimes he just gets beat off the snap. I mean, he just loses off the snap, right? So that's a huge problem. Cleveland was a significant liability from a pass protection perspective last year. This year, he's playing a little bit better. I'm not going to suggest that he is an above average pass protection guard. I think as a run blocker, he's actually quite good. But as a pass protection guard, I would say he's still below average. It's just not as alarming as it was before. And Austin Schlottman is both, in playing in place of Garrett Bradbury, is both playing above my expectation and is also a problem because I just don't expect a lot out of backup offensive linemen. Maybe that's just by history covering the Vikings coming to the fore, but it's bad across the league, right? And so he's not playing remarkably well, but way better than I thought he would. So, long answer, but I think that kind of gives you some sense of kind of what's happening. Which I mean, I think to the Chargers end, I mean, as far as I know, the Chargers offensive line is healthier than I remember it being for a little bit. Has that been like a huge boon? Is that kind of where some of the excitement or optimism comes from?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've got, Lindsley in the center who is healthy and, calling the protections and getting guys lined up. Slater's back, which is huge because now you don't have Jamari Salyer playing left tackle. I mean, Slater is probably one of the top 4 or 5 tackles in the league. And then you've got the new guard tandem. Last year, Matt Filer was awful at left guard last year. He really struggled. Having Zion there has been an upgrade. Zion's had a couple of struggles. He got beat late in the Dolphins game. He got beat late again last week. But he's been really, really good in the run game. They are establishing a really exciting identity in the run game as a downhill power running attack. Whereas in years past, they were really an outside zone scheme and they just weren't suited for it. So having two hosses like Zion and like Salyer playing guard who are able to pull and get out in space and pick guys up at the second level has been really big for them. And Pipkins, for the most part, has been pretty good. He exceeded my expectations last year. He had a little bit of a struggle at the end of the Dolphins game, but the whole line did. The whole line broke down at the end there in the fourth quarter. But overall, they've done a pretty good job of protecting Herbert. They've been good to at times great in the run game, and they've been healthy, and they've been much better than I think anything the Chargers have had probably since 2009, if not longer, maybe 2006. Wow. I mean, that's how long it's been.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had a revolving door of, just terrible offensive linemen. I mean, Trent Scott playing left tackle and, all kinds of Mike Schofield playing guard. And
what's crazy? Mike Harris, who was not a very good tackle for the Chargers, if I remember correctly.
He was not.
He comes to the Vikings, plays a little bit of tackle, and it's not going great. It's going better than it did with the Chargers, but it's not going great. And then he moves to guard, and he plays lights out. He is this tremendously good guard. And then he just has like an illness, like a brain illness, and he just can't. He retires from football. And it's like, oh my gosh, this guy for both of these teams have historically bad offensive lines, was playing really poorly, finally found a chance to kind of reclaim what he can do. And then suddenly, like, his Uber driver notices that he's just bleeding from his nose. He has to go to the hospital, and now he can't play football ever again. Like, it's just like, oh, you've got to be kidding me. Yeah.
That's crazy. And Mike Harris was one of the names I was trying to remember, and I couldn't remember it. So you basically read my mind there. So thank you for that. There's a Mike something. I can't place it. It was Mike Harris. Yeah. So thank you. We're synced up there.
Perfect. Yeah. And we also share. I think Storm Norton was a Charger, right?
Yes. And we're all very glad that he's a Viking now. We're sorry, but we're not really sorry. We'll put it that way.
He's tall. I'll give him that.
He's a big boy. That's about all he's got going for him. So let's talk a little bit about scheme. What kind of offensive concepts or schemes do you think we could see from the Vikings, we being the Chargers? And I can't believe I just used we on a podcast, but what kind of offensive schemes do you think the Chargers will see from the Vikings on Sunday? Designing things to get Jefferson open or get Hawkinson open, or maybe even get the ball to Addison.
Yeah, so some of the things that we've seen, like just from a running perspective, it's what you'd expect from a McVay Shanahan type offense, where it's a bunch of wide zone. They manipulate some things here or there, where maybe they don't actually attack the outside of the wide zone like you'd expect. But it's basically it's zone running. And right before O'Connell arrived, with Mike Zimmer and the Kubiak type schemes, you'd expect it to have been similar, and in a lot of ways it was. But they tried a more diverse running game then, where you had a lot more power, where you had a lot more like gap style runs. And now there's a lot less of it. They still have it, right? They still have, they're still running power O sometimes, right? I mean, it's just like those are the things that you expect to see in a running game, but it is very much focused on making sure that they can win the outside zone, the inside zone, and then they'll fold in some man running concepts. And it's honestly a little bit better that they do it sometimes because Alexander Mattison, the running back, yeah, I mean, his one cut is actually a lot better than people think. I mean, he is kind of a zone style runner in that he can plant and go, but there's just kind of he can't stretch, right? Which is kind of what you really hope for in a wide zone. He can't get to the edge fast enough. And so sometimes they'll have to throw in some of this power stuff just so that, hey, you're following a guard, make sure that the wrapper gets up to the second level and gets to that guy. So they'll mix some of that stuff in, but it is primarily a zone running thing. And then that allows them to build play action off of it. They're not as heavy of a play action team as I would have expected coming out of McVay. Last year, they didn't run play action as much as I liked. This year, they're running it a little bit more, but it is not, part of the bread and butter as much as it was with the Kubiaks. And so we're seeing, hey, they're going to run zone. They're going to run play action off of that zone. They're going to have Kirk Cousins naked, so they're not going to protect him, but that gives them another guy in the flats. And Cousins is so good at play action. He's so good at figuring out. I mean, it's a half field read, so that simplifies it, but he's a very quick decision maker. He's much better throwing on the run than you'd expect. So, I mean, that's, really good for kind of a rollout type scheme. And he knows who his targets are and how to get to them. And so there's a little bit of that, but a lot of times, a lot of this, the offense from down to down, especially because they throw the ball so much, just a normal drop back passing scheme. A lot of times it's, you'll see some of the stuff that you see from every offense, like your normal, double slants or daggers or whatever. But a lot of times it's like kind of boutique play design where they design a play specifically for kind of some of the unique coverages they see from the opposing defense, which they even did it against the Eagles. And the Eagles, they played on the road on a short week. I think it's 4 days between games. And so for them to be able to install plays were very specific to the way the Eagles have shown their coverage in the past, understanding that Jefferson is going to get not just a double team, but this kind of double team that puts defenders in this position, you're going to have some trail opportunities here and there, putting Hawkinson in that particular void, right? And so there is some very specific game planning that comes from taking a look at what that defense specifically does and finding ways to attack it. They've become very good at attacking the Fangio style defenses that, Brandon Staley is known to run, the quarter half type, safety set or deep coverage setup that we see. A lot of times they'll attack the near safety in quarter half and cover 6 with a crosser and then just run a guy over top of it and make that safety make a choice, make sure that guy's always wrong. And what benefited that is that it is an inherently explosive passing system. Either you get Jefferson open or you get Hawkinson. And Hawkinson is a good seam runner. They don't really use him like an explosive tight end. And I think that's just kind of one of the sacrifices that you make to get Jefferson and Addison open. But if it's not there, you get Hawkinson for 9 yards. But Addison is this burner. They've been using him a lot on these kind of, again, designed plays where Jefferson runs something underneath, Addison shoots up, and most of the time that ball goes to Jefferson, but sometimes it doesn't. And Cousins knows that, hey, this play has an alert. If they just abandon Addison, I'm going to throw it to him, which some quarterbacks just can't do. They really need, the if thens, right? Like that's, I think Benjamin Solak had a great video about how Jared Goff doesn't do that, but Matthew Stafford does, right? And that's, Cousins is becoming more of that kind of quarterback where, hey, this thing has changed a little bit. Let's take a look at that. So that's kind of what you're seeing from the offense. There's an intermediate throwing aspect to it that's pretty heavy. There's an explosiveness aspect to it that's pretty heavy. And then to complement that, they don't throw it short that much, but they will throw screens. And so instead of having a heavy slant or flat game, it's going to be more screens. And I know some Vikings fans hate it. Honestly, I think it's fine. And you need to have those in your offense, especially when your offensive line is as bad as it is. Like you cannot have a pure explosive passing game if your offensive line is as bad as it is. So a lot of screens.
All right. Yeah, I think some of the things that we're seeing from Kellen Moore with the Chargers offense that's making it different, and I mentioned some of them earlier. Number one is a difference in the running game. Going from more of that outside zone to more of a downhill power attack has been huge for them. It really suits all their running backs really well. And I mentioned as well last week what we started to see was they got away from the horizontal passing attack and they were looking for chunk plays in the middle of the field. They started attacking the seams. They did it with Mike Williams a couple times. They did it with Keenan. They did it with Stone Smart. They're trying to find opportunities to get Mike Williams the ball in space. So they're running more like quick slants and digs and things like that with him, trying to get him the ball on the move in space, which is working really well. They haven't really pushed the ball down the field a whole lot, but they are getting more of those 15 to 20-yard chunk plays that kind of jumpstart drives and get things going. And they're attacking that void between the linebackers and the safeties, which is something they really didn't do for the last 2 years. So,
yeah, which given Herbert's arm, like, what are you doing? Right?
Yeah, I know, right? That's why the horizontal passing game week 1 was so frustrating because it looked just like the Lombardi offense.
Yeah.
I mean, they're throwing, bubble screens to Mike Williams, who, I mean, he's a big guy, but he's not that fast. He's not going to make people miss. They're checking down a lot to Eckler. They're checking down a lot to the tight ends underneath. They're not really getting the chunk plays. And they took some shots down the field week 1, but it was only a couple, and they missed most of them. Last week they took a few more. They weren't that great on the deep stuff, but they were really good in the intermediate deep areas. So that's kind of where the offense is evolving, and I think we'll see more of that moving forward. Hopefully, the running game is working for them this week, and they can run more play action and get the ball down the field that way. I would like to see more bootlegs with Justin Herbert. He's kind of become a sitting target in the pocket, whereas in his first year, they were moving him around a lot of naked bootlegs, having him throw on the run. They're not doing that as much. I'd also really like to see them use his legs as part of the running game. I think we'll see it at some point.
Guy, yeah.
Yeah, he's a very athletic guy. He was very effective running the ball in college, and they just haven't asked him to do that for whatever reason. The Lynn staff asked him to run a little bit more. For whatever reason, Staley just doesn't want him to do it. And I don't know if they're trying to protect him or what the deal is, but I'd like to see them free him up a little bit more. Get him out on the edge of the defense, particularly on 3rd and short and in the red zone, and give him a chance to use his legs to make plays. I think it'll just add a wrinkle to the offense that teams aren't necessarily ready for.
Well, so kind of speaking of ways to grow and evolve the offense, like what's the feeling on Quentin Johnston? It feels like there's not been much involvement at all. Like you're taking because there's a lot of ways to use a 3 receiver offense. Kellen Moore knows, right? And so to me, it feels like, because I mean, Seattle, which usually runs a lot of 2 wide receiver, they're finding ways to get Jackson Smith and Jigba involved. Obviously, we saw what Cincinnati did, but Kellen Moore in Dallas was able to say, hey, CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup and Amari Cooper or whoever, the third guy is going to be, right? We know how to use these guys all together to, and they would consistently field 3 receivers, right? And it just feels like that's not the issue. It feels like it's not like, hey, we don't know how to put 3 receivers on the field and maintain that core identity. It feels like it might be a Quentin Johnston thing.
It could be. It's interesting because the first name you mentioned with the Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb, when they drafted Quentin Johnston, one of my co-hosts has a contact with the Chargers who told him they envisioned him taking that CeeDee Lamb role when they drafted him. That Kellen Moore pounded the table, so to speak, for Quentin Johnston, and he said, I want him. He's my CeeDee Lamb. I need him to make this offense run. So we all figured he'd have a fairly big role immediately coming out of the draft, and that just hasn't happened. He had some issues with dropping the ball in preseason and in camp, particularly late in camp. Excuse me. For me, it feels like they just don't have a plan for him. And it kind of also feels like they haven't figured out how he's different from Mike Williams and Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer yet. It seems like they're giving Mike Williams a lot of the touches that Quentin Johnston should be getting, a lot of those bubble screens, smoke screens, getting the ball in space, have him make somebody miss and pick up 7, 8, 9, 10 yards or more. That was something that he excelled at in college, in addition to the deep stuff. And they just haven't. They've been giving those touches to Mike Williams, and it's not really his thing. It just seems
it feels like a poor fit, right? Yeah,
it's a really poor fit. And they've got a guy on the roster who they got for his yak ability, and now they're not using him. So part of me wonders if they're just making him earn it. He came out early in training camp and said he already had wide receiver 3 locked up. I mean, like a week into mini camp. It was like, I'm wide receiver 3. I've got it locked up. And so they might just be teaching the rookie a lesson about, hey, let's keep this stuff in house, and you're going to have to earn your snaps.
I get it. That's an expensive lesson, right? Because it's 2 close games, 2 losses, right? It's
a very expensive lesson. And I think part of it might also be, honestly, Joshua Palmer. He is not as talented as Quentin Johnston is, but he's a good wide receiver, and he earned his snaps last year. So he earned the right to be on the field this year.
Well, and he had some big moments these last 2 games. Like, it's not as if he's like this pure liability. So I get it. I wonder if it's the lesson thing, but I just, at some part of me also feels like if he could be a meaningful upgrade over Josh Palmer, at least in these 2 games, right? He probably would be. And, it's not the end of the world. Justin Jefferson didn't start the first 2 games for the Vikings, right? So, these things happen. But
Johnston played, I think, 22 snaps in the first week, and it was fewer than that last week. And so you'd like to see, if he's on the field, that they're at least drawing something up for him to take advantage of what his unique skill set is. and they haven't even done that. It seems like he's on the field as a decoy right now. So Darius Davis has more touches so far than Quentin Johnson does, and he was a 4th-round pick. So make sense of that for me. I think they're probably making him earn it, but it's frustrating people because they figured he was going to be getting those deep passes, and it just hasn't happened yet. It seems like the Vikings defense played pretty well week 1, then they had their struggles last week. What's kind of holding them back? What are they struggling with? What are they doing well right now?
I think from a total roster perspective, the Vikings have one of the worst defensive personnel groups in the NFL, which is tough because they have some extremely talented players. It makes it really difficult for you to feel confident saying that. Like Danielle Hunter is playing lights out, and whenever he's been healthy, he's played lights out. He's a very good producer, right? Byron Murphy, it seems like he's earning his contract. I mean, he was one of the top cornerbacks in free agency. The Vikings signed him. He's playing pretty well. Harrison Smith is a legend, and for a pretty good reason, right? I mean, he's a perpetual All-Pro, or he was. And that's, been great. But you take a look at this roster as a whole. Marcus Davenport wasn't able to play week 1 because of an injury. And then week 2, he was on and off the field because of injury. And then they just don't have any depth along edge rusher. Harrison Phillips is a very good defensive interior player, but they don't have anyone else. They signed Dean Lowry from the Packers coming off of an off season in the hopes that Lowry would play more like 2021 than 2022. And that's not materializing. He played very poorly, especially against the Eagles. So, I mean, these are some pretty big problems. They let go of Eric Kendricks, as you know, and though Kendricks had a pretty poor year last year, that was a situation where, to me, I was just like, it's more likely that the defensive coordinator's problem than Eric Kendricks, and I think that's borne out. But they did need to move on from a number of players, and Kendricks was one of them, and. Jordan Hicks is, to me, not a very good linebacker, and they're figuring out the other linebacker position. It's either Brian Asamoah, 3rd-round pick from last year, or Ivan Pace, who is this just phenomenal undrafted free agent rookie from this year. He's out-snapping Asamoah, and he's playing really well at the things he's asked to do. He is not being asked to play a wide variety of roles typically expected of a starting linebacker, and so others have to kind of cover for the fact that he's not going to always hit his coverage landmarks. And so the Vikings are not going to ask him to always play coverage. They're just going to blitz him. He's one of the best blitzing linebackers already in the NFL. And so they're just like, well, go. But that means there's some coverage voids. And now Jordan Hicks, who was a super athlete when he came out in the draft, like in 2014 or whenever it was, is now a step slower. And so he just can't do it. You've got players like Harrison Smith who are playing below their career averages. I think Smith has lost a step. You've got players like Cameron Bynum that are playing lights out. Bynum is playing so well. It's fantastic. You've had issues where, the Vikings play a lot of free safety. They don't really play as much 3 corner. They play a lot of 3 safety. Josh Metellus got hurt last game. They put in Theo Jackson. Theo Jackson, the 4th safety on your roster is a special teams guy, right? He's not going to be good from scrimmage. And Theo Jackson played out of his mind, but he was still the 4th safety, so he gave up a big play, right? And it wasn't even his fault, really. He got mossed. I mean, that just happens. He was in the right spot. He played it perfectly, didn't get pass interference, but guys make plays, right? So that's kind of like, those are kind of the things that happen. Caleb Evans, the starting corner, he's playing a lot better than you expect a 2nd-year, 4th-round corner to play. So from an investment perspective, the Vikings are getting their money's worth, but he's a starter. And now the expectations are that he consistently plays well as a starter. And he is mostly getting saved by the fact that the Vikings are getting pressure with their blitz scheme more than he is his like sticky coverage. He's like losing guys on occasion. And so that's kind of what's happening, is that I imagine a lot of the players that I named are not players that most fans are familiar with their names, right? If I did this in 2017 and I was like, yeah, they got, Xavier Rhodes is playing really well. Trey Waynes is finally playing really well. Harrison Smith is playing lights out. Danielle Hunter is killing it. Everson Griffin is having this. Everyone knows who those guys are if you follow the NFL like reasonably closely, right? Like, but now I'm just like, yeah, so this is who, Kairos Tonga is. He's getting a lot of snaps. And it's like, okay, some of these guys, maybe deserve a little bit more publicity, but not a lot. They're not amazing players. And some of them are playing way better than you expect. But the thing is, the Vikings just haven't invested in the defense enough for you to say, if everyone is playing above expectation, it's a good defense. Because a lot of people are playing above expectation, and it's not. That said, from a success rate perspective, they're very good against the pass. The problem is they're giving up explosives here or there. Now, part of that is just that's what a Brian Flores defense is. You're just going to blitz a lot. Your successes are going to be huge. Your failures are going to be huge. There's not a lot in between. And for the most part, for most Brian Flores defenses, that works out in the aggregate. I mean, in 2020, the Dolphins ranked, like, I think they finished 6th in EPA, 2nd in points, right? And that was an okay roster. It wasn't phenomenal. They had some stars like Xavier Howard. They just signed Byron Jones. But they're playing with, like, whoever at edge rusher. It was before they grabbed Jalen Phillips, right? So that's kind of where the Vikings are at, is that they've got this kind of okay-ish, below average roster, some stars here or there. They can't make up for the fact that Zadarius Smith demanded a trade and ended up getting released. They can't, make up for the fact that Dalvin Tomlinson was too expensive for them to retain in free agency. And so now they're trotting out these guys that are really great to have on a roster, but probably shouldn't be taking 50 snaps a game. That said, again, pretty good play to play against the pass. It's some of these explosives. Against the Eagles, they gave up, 259 yards on the ground, which is crazy. Like 6.5 yards a carry, nearly 8 to DeAndre Swift. And the guys weren't big enough. There's not really much. They have one guy over 300 pounds. Like, you're going to get beat up in the run game, especially when the offensive line is as good as Philadelphia's. So I think for the most part, that's a pretty good model. But when you've got a team that is quarterback dominant in terms of the run game, like a Jalen Hurts, like Lamar Jackson, or a Daniel Jones, or any Desmond Ridder, it seems like is going to be a run dominant quarterback. When you're up against that, there's just not a lot of recourse for the way that current Vikings roster is set up. They're doing a lot. They're overperforming. Brian Flores is doing so much to improve that defense over Ed Donatel, but the horses aren't there, and sometimes they just fall behind. Sometimes, it's Theo Jackson against Devontae Smith, and you're just like, yeah, good luck.
So let me pull up. I've got some visual aids for us here. Let's talk a little bit about the Vikings defense versus the Chargers offense. Bring that up here. All right. So if you were an offensive coordinator, and you kind of talked about it already, but let's hit on it. Let's talk about 2 or 3 guys that you would pick on in coverage in the Vikings defense and how you would go about doing that.
Yeah, well, so I think first that the middle of the Vikings defense, you see Hicks and Asamoah. A lot of times, actually, it's going to be Pace instead of Asamoah. I would pick on that a lot, especially because the Vikings will bring their linebackers up to the line of scrimmage, so they'll have 6 or 7 guys on the line of scrimmage, and one of those linebackers, maybe none, but one of those linebackers, or possibly both, but usually one, will drop back into coverage. Right? That's a tough task. Right? A lot of it is to manipulate the pass protection, create one-on-ones. And, Zimmer's done this a lot. Flores is doing this a lot. But it creates some problems. In fact, it became so much of a problem that the Vikings asked Theo Jackson, the fourth safety that I was talking about, they asked Theo Jackson to be a linebacker on some of these plays. And that's how they got a pick off of Jalen Hurts, is that they had Theo Jackson pretend, or I shouldn't say pretend, but act as a linebacker in a dime package, pretend to rush up the A gap, and then he just robots back to cover the dig, and he grabs that pick. And it's just like, a linebacker is not going to do that. A linebacker does not have the speed to do that, but that's what they're asking the linebackers to do on a play-to-play basis. So I would play action, attack the middle of the field on a fairly regular basis. I don't know how important or how often we see RPOs in the Chargers offense, but I would imagine if you key your RPO off of, Jordan Hicks, who is such a late blitzer. Like, the scheme asks him to push forward a lot, and he just doesn't trigger for whatever reason. He triggers all right against the run. He moves off the snap all right when it's coverage, but when it's a blitz, it just takes him forever to get into the pocket. I would absolutely RPO off of that guy. So that's where primarily I would attack. I would attack Hicks, then I would attack Pace or SMO, whoever's out there that snap. And then I would, try and figure out kind of what is that third defensive back situation, right? Is it Josh Metellus? If it is, I would attack him with a shiftier guy. If it's Theo Jackson, I would attack him with a bigger guy. If it's Mekhi Blackman, I would definitely attack him with a bigger guy. Mekhi Blackman is like 173 pounds. Like, just push him. You're fine. Right? So that's, you'd kind of have to figure out kind of what that setup is going to look like for who the third, I shouldn't say third, the fifth defensive back is. And the Vikings will lighten the box a lot. And so they'll take, so you see Lowry, Phillips, and Bullard there. Well, Bullard is not very good against the run. He's primarily a pass rusher. Lowry gets pushed around a lot in the run. And so if they're there, I would, very seriously consider running the ball. And if they're not, you've probably got Kyrus Tonga in there. He's their other 300-pound guy. Then you're just like, oh, well, now they're probably not going to be able to rush the passer. So they're going to make up for it by blitzing. Well, where's kind of the hole in that blitz? We're going to vacate it. So that's primarily the way I would go about it. It's to try and identify the way that Vikings, the way that they maximize their players because of how limited the skill set of some of these players are. The way that they maximize those players comes at a pretty serious cost. It's like I win here and I lose there, and just try to figure out where those players lose because they're not as well rounded as Kendricks was when he was in a Vikings uniform. They're not as well rounded as like Fred Warner, which maybe that's not a fair comparison, but if you see Fred Warner blitz, you're not guaranteed that there's going to be a hole in that coverage, right?
Right.
But when you see, Jordan, you got a little extra time. Jordan Hicks is blitzing. I'll wait a second. It'll take him a little bit. So we'll see how the play develops, kind of thing. But yeah, that's primarily. I mean, honestly, the Vikings, I think right now are the heaviest blitzing team in the NFL. If not, it's the Buccaneers, and the Vikings are too. Drop all your blitz beaters. That's your offense, basically. They'll blitz like 55, 60% of the time.
All right. Well, I appreciate that insight. I think if you're looking at the Chargers offense, particularly the offensive line, I think you're testing really Salyer and Johnson in pass protection, and you're trying to see if you can sneak by them when the Chargers are running the ball. They've both been really good in the run game. They both had some breakdowns in the pass in pass protection, particularly Johnson the first 2 weeks. So I think, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Vikings run some stunts and games up front, try to confuse the protection schemes a little bit and get free runs at the quarterback. What we've seen in the first 2 weeks is there are some weaknesses just in the pass protection scheme for the Chargers. They struggle with wide nine. You can go wide nine, load one side of the field, and the tackle and the guard will split, and you'll get a free shot at Herbert right through the B gap. So there are opportunities to create free runners there. Hopefully they're working on fixing that, but it's been a big issue the first 2 weeks, particularly in big spots. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the Chargers are going to try to find that void between the linebackers and the safeties. I would imagine they will probably try to attack Harrison Smith deep. He's getting a little long in the tooth. I think they'll probably try to see if they can get the ball over the top of him at times. And I think they'll attack the seams quite a bit. Try to pick up more of those 12, 15, 18-yard plays, maybe create some catch and run opportunities up the seam at times. And we know the Chargers are going to come out and try to establish the run, especially if the Vikings are undersized. They were really committed to the run against the Dolphins. They stayed committed to the run against the Titans, although they weren't really able to get much traction with that. I have a feeling that'll probably be different this week. So I think those are some matchups that you're looking at with the Chargers. And let's take a look here at the Vikings offense versus the Chargers defense. So if you are the Chargers defensive coordinator, if you're Brandon Staley and Derek Ainsley, what matchups are you looking for on the offensive line? And what are you doing to try to keep Justin Jefferson from going for $150 again?
Yeah, no, so this is, I think, a pretty interesting defense to have to figure out. First, because Derwin James can do anything, right? And so the first thing you do, I think, every play, it's not, hey, I guess, I don't see Joey Bosa here on this little thing.
He was banged up last week. He was banged up last week. He will probably play. I don't know how much he'll play. He was a kind of a situational rusher last week.
Yeah, and he's interesting because it feels like he doesn't have, and I hate saying this about a guy that I think is elite. It feels like he, in that first week, that he didn't have it. And by that, I don't mean like he's got get off and he's got bend, but it felt like he lost his balance a lot. And maybe that's just the opposing offensive lineman, but it felt like he was on the ground a lot more than I've ever seen Bosa do it. And it felt like there was something. So I don't know what's up with that, but I think that for the most part, Khalil Mack is a great name, but obviously it's not what he was. The guy that you're looking for is Derwin James, and finding ways to see, first of all, what he's going to do and account for it, but finding ways around it. So that is primarily what I'm going to do. Other than that, I would, if I'm the Vikings offense, I'm taking a look at what Kenneth Murray is doing, and I'm attacking that guy no matter what. I like figuring out kind of what gap he's defending. That's probably where I'm going to run the ball. Figuring out where zone landmarks are. That's where I'm going to throw the ball. Neiman is an interesting guy. As a linebacker, he did not strike me as particularly athletic in the draft, and then I think he had just amazing testing, just this astounding testing. And so I was like, oh, well, maybe he's actually just a really good special teamer. I don't know that much about him as an NFL linebacker, if I'm being 100% honest. I just know about him in college and kind of what my draft takes on him were. But to me, that seems like an area where you could do a little bit of damage. And hey, attacking the Chargers linebackers, it feels like that's historically just been something over the past couple of years that people have tried to do a lot and have been relatively successful. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. That cornerback group is also interesting because last year they way overperformed, even though JC Jackson dud, right? Like it's like, okay, so your big free agency cornerback signing means nothing, and the cornerback group is still playing really well. That's so interesting. I think this is a situation where I would probably keep these guys moving. And by that, I mean, like, you don't have the ability to as easily jam off of press or play with a lot of patience because you're motioning all of these guys and trying to move their landmarks or move them in man coverage. If they're playing in zone, obviously emotion is going to reveal that. If they're playing in man coverage, emotion is most likely because now you've got man match rules. So motioning is not as effective in declaring coverages as it used to be, but you've mostly got an idea of kind of who they're going to be covering or how that coverage is going to play out and stuff like that. And I would keep Jefferson, particularly Jefferson, in motion all around the offense so you can create these matchups and attack kind of what these defenses are trying to do. I know that Staley likes to run a lot of quarter half, and so figuring out what Alohi Gilman is doing and seeing if he nails the crosser a lot when he's got a quarters assignment, and if he doesn't, having Hawkinson just hit those crossers until Gilman bites, and then running something up on top of Gilman with either Osborne, Addison, or Jefferson. I think you could do all of those things. Now, the Vikings are just not very good at running the ball. They're a lot better than I think the statistics would suggest because they don't take a lot of tackles for loss, given how poor the run yardage is. Like they're averaging like 3.1 yards per carry, something so bad like that. But there's not a ton of negative plays. It's all like, yeah, you ran for 1 yard. Great. Good job. But primarily they get almost as much yardage as you need and never more. I think Madison's largest gain this year has been 9 yards. He's hit it twice. And it feels like that's basically where the ceiling is at for him. And a lot of other backs, they'll hit 9 yards and then they'll hit, 11 more. And that's just not happening with Madison, but they will get like the 4 yards you may need on first down. Right. And so that's kind of what the run game looks like. And if I'm taking a look at this Chargers interior, unless something has changed a lot about these guys, feels like for the most part, these guys are pretty movable, right? It feels like these guys up the middle have, some opportunities to create some space for you. It feels like this has been a consistent problem for the Chargers over the past couple of years. Feels like their draft picks at those positions have not really worked out. I'm kind of interested in what Tui Pelotu's like role is, because to me, when I was looking at him in the draft, he seemed like a pretty athletic 5 tech. To me, I didn't want him at the edge, but I also didn't think he was big enough for the middle. And so you would occupy this kind of middle assignment that would allow him to be more effective against the run than a lot of edge rushers, more effective against the rush than a lot of defensive tackles, and try and figure out a scheme for him. I don't really know what his role for the Chargers defense is going to be, but if it's going to have to hold up against guards, I would probably see if I can run into him a little bit. That's kind of where I'm at. I think that, with Asante Samuel and Michael Davis, I think they've played pretty well last year, but I think the Vikings receivers are just better. So sometimes you get man coverage, just try it.
Yeah, I think those are all fair assessments. Murray, he's a guy that people attack every week, week in and week out. He probably had his best game as a Charger last week against the Titans, and a lot of it was because they just had him firing downhill. He blitzed a lot. He was really effective in the run game. And surprisingly, I would have expected the Titans to just run the ball down the Chargers' throat. They held Derrick Henry to 80 yards on 23 carries. So they were actually pretty solid in the run game. They got hurt a little bit by Tajay Spears at times, got gashed with a couple big runs, but otherwise they were pretty steady in the run game and they held up pretty well. I think, you look at the Chargers defensive line group. There are no Chargers draft picks outside of Tui on that list. All those guys are veterans that the Chargers brought in from outside. So when you say that their draft picks haven't panned out outside of Bosa, you are absolutely right. They do not. They don't seem to value defensive linemen very well in the draft. They don't seem to develop them very well. They've had a really hard time finding guys who can just stay on the field. I mean, Tillery was awful. They've had one defensive tackle after another who busted up and down the draft board. It's just been bad. So, Austin Johnson, Nick Williams, Sebastian Joseph, I think those guys are all pretty good on the interior as long as the linebackers are supporting them. And the linebackers have not supported them the last couple of years. And they've had a lot of problems tackling at the third level as well, which is why they've given up so many big runs. So I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think for the Chargers, they have to create interior pressure. They have to. You can rely on Mack and Bosa and Tuli all you want, but at the end of the day, they have to be able to get in Cousins' face quickly, immediate interior pressure, and that's something they've struggled with for a while now. So I would expect to see some A-gap blitzes, probably with Derwin, probably with Tuli, probably with Murray, and I would expect to see some stunts and games up front to try to attack that Vikings interior and try to create some pressure, particularly if Bradbury isn't able to play. I think they will.
Yeah.
I think they'll try to confuse the backup center and really attack them that way.
Yeah, and I think that there's just been kind of a history of communication problems on that interior, especially with Ed Ingram, that would really enable, having those twists and stunts up front. It's interesting because the Vikings would twist and stunt a lot in practices against that offensive line, and it would kind of shut down. I mean, it would make practices difficult, right? Because it would kind of shut down the offense. You'd have to blow the whistle and say how Cousins was sacked. Then they didn't really do it a ton in the first 2 weeks with a ton of twists and stunts. Brian Flores is really well known for having a really well developed and mature game essentially, and they haven't done it a lot. So I don't know how much this defensive line or this offensive line can react to that sort of thing in live game situations because the Eagles are just basically, we got a bunch of better guys. We're going to rush the passer. They'll twist and stun a fair amount, but it's not to the degree that I would expect if I was game planning against the Vikings. And so if the Chargers are willing to do it, and maybe that'll make them a little bit softer against the run, that's kind of one of the risks that you take. But if the Chargers are willing to do it, I think that could create a lot of havoc, especially because honestly, being soft against the run is just not a concern I would have going up against the Vikings right now. It's make them earn it. Make them get a 10-yard run before you respect it, is kind of where I'd be. So I would run a ton of those. I know Mack used to be a really great spinner to go up the middle, and maybe he still is. But that's something I would definitely explore. I think Tuipulotu is a really good asset in that capacity as well. Get some of those edge guys on 3-man stunts onto the inside, into the B and the A gaps, that I think could really create a lot of problems because Darisaw, he's injured right now, so he's not playing up to the level that he should be. But Darisaw is a really high level tackle. O'Neal is a really fantastic right tackle, and beating them straight up, like a healthy Bosa. Yeah. That makes sense. He could do that. Khalil Mack. Yeah. I could see him beating Darisaw straight up a couple of times, but why make it difficult? You don't have to. So I think that's probably, kind of what I would do. Given all that, given what you said about that Chargers and that the way that Chargers defense has been set up, do you think that is just primarily a personnel and a scouting problem? Do you think that there's something with the way Brandon Staley runs a defense that just makes it inherently a little bit less stable than it should be? Are these guys underperforming? Or are they just not as talented as they need to be?
I think, most of these guys were hurt last year. Austin Johnson was hurt for a good chunk of last year. He's just coming back from a pretty bad knee injury. Joseph Day has been good in spots, but not consistent. Williams is bringing the team, so we haven't really seen a lot of him. I think these are guys who they're veterans who can hold up. They haven't been, dominant by any stretch. They're not difference makers, but I think that's just kind of how they're building the defense. It seems like they're trying to build the defense from the outside in instead of the inside out. and it just hasn't panned out.
Yeah, I mean, it just takes, and you got to hit obviously on your draft picks, but sometimes it just like takes a lot of time to figure out kind of what the vision of the defense is going to be and how to make that work out. But yeah, I don't know. That's there's just like a lot kind of that needs to kind of go in the right direction because defense is a weak link. Fundamentally, it's just a weak link phenomena. Is that your defense is largely only as good as your worst position, and teams will go out of their way to attack it. And it feels like the Chargers have not been able to figure out ways to shore that up. So I don't know. The Vikings offense is like very good in my opinion. So I feel like it's gonna be a high scoring game.
I think it probably will. I think if the Chargers are able to run the ball and run some play action and get the ball down the field, I think it's going to be a pretty high scoring game. And if it's not, the Chargers have some explaining to do with bringing more in and not being able to score on this defense. I think it's going to be problematic. So we'll see. We'll see how things turn out. So let's make a couple predictions here. What do you think? What do you think the final score of this game is going to be? Who's going to win, and what's the score going to be?
Like I said, I think it's a high scoring game. I don't know what the over under is. If it's around 50, that would make a lot of sense, which is at the higher end for the NFL right now. I would say I would probably pick the Vikings. Let's make it a close game. 31-28. I think, just tear somebody's heart out, I think.
And if you're going to tear somebody's heart out, it might as well be the Chargers because that's usually what's happening. I'm going to go 34-30 Chargers.
Whew. Yeah, I mean, that'll hurt. Yeah, it's like it's a high scoring game, probably close, probably a 1-score game. Wouldn't be shocked if it came down to the final drive.
I think that's probably what's going to happen, just with the way these two teams play.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, Arif, I really appreciate you coming on. I think this was a great show. I'm sure everybody's going to enjoy it. So why don't you go ahead and tell everybody how they can find you if they want to check out your podcast?
Yeah, no, for sure. So the North Code podcast, you can be found on like all of the available podcasting platforms, iTunes, etc., Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well. You can find me on Twitter at Arif Hasan NFL. It's ArifHasan NFL. And you can find me on I think I'm on Threads. I'm Arif Hasan on Blue Sky. I'm Arif.bsky.social. I was there early, so I was able to just grab my first name, which was nice. But all my written work can be found over at my Substack, which is wideleftpost.substack.com. I have a piece. I just talked about Puka Nacua for a little bit. I have a piece about how much I actually think his start is for real. And I compared him, or I guess I contrasted him to Jeremy Lin. So people who are excited about that, check that out.
Cool. Well, I'm sure people will. I know we've got a lot of fans of your work in our Discord. So
I'm glad to hear that.
So again, thank you. I really appreciate you coming on. I think this was a great show, a lot of fun, and everybody appreciates it. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Yeah, I had a ton of fun. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. So for those of you who don't remember, we have our new schedule out. Obviously, Wednesdays are my day with the walkthrough. Thursday coming up is our new mailbag show, the Roundtable. Friday, Craig will have his normal I Got 5 on it. We'll have the post-game show on Sunday, and then we'll get back to Garrett with Score More next Tuesday. So thanks, everybody. We appreciate you tuning in and supporting us, and we will see you next time.